Just waiting for it. And I think we're live. Andrew, how are we doing today?
Doing well, Sean. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited. So this is uh, really the first episode we're going to be doing on this format where we've watched Rocky 4 this week. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to have a chat about whether this film is actually good. When was the last time you watched Rocky?
The original one?
Well, any of them, really.
Well, Rocky 4, I watched in preparation for our discussion today, which was about week and a half ago. Rocky, the original one, oh, it's been a few years. I'm not sure if I've watched it since we moved to this house. But true story, which you'll appreciate. One of the times I watched it when I was living in South Philly, there came a scene, and it's the scene, if you recall the original film, where he meets that young girl on the street who has kind of a filthy mouth,
Yeah.
and he gives her the lecture about like, hey, you think you're impressing these guys, but when you get older, blah 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 blah. They're not going
Yes.
to want to date a girl with that kind of mouth. Well, anyway, he starts out walking towards the camera, and then the angle shifts, and you see him from the side. And I'm watching with my wife, and I'm looking at the shot, and I'm looking at the fire escape behind him. And
Yeah.
I'm looking at that fire escape. I'm like, that fire escape looks really familiar, which is a very odd thought to have, like, familiar fire escape, right? But I'm looking at it, I'm like, I think I know that fire escape. And then it dawned on me, I knew it for a good reason. It was 2 blocks from my house. I walked the dog right up to it. I don't even think it was 2, I think it was like a block and a half all the time. I'm like, oh, that's the fire escape on such and such. No, it was 2. And of course, we stopped the movie, and I'm like, let me run out and I'll show you. And there it was. And if you backed up, you could see that he'd actually walked off of the opening shot, the one he's walking towards the camera. You could see the name of our street above his head, way up the top of the shot, where probably you'd watch the movie 1,000 times and never see a street sign because it's kind of
Yeah.
dark and it's above his head. There's no reason to be looking at it. But then, yeah, they shot that scene like basically a block and a half from my house, and he drops her off at a house that was around the corner from me, and they pretend like that's our house and all this. Well, that was exciting.
Yeah, I found landmark tours of Philadelphia are quite a popular item for people that come back with me or people that visit me from here. So for
Oh,
anybody
really?
who's not watched this before, I live in England, and I've done more Rocky tours than anything. The number of times I've taken British people to the art museum steps to run up and down. It's I've
Oh,
done that
yeah.
probably more than anything else.
You take them to the Italian market too, so they can run through the Italian market.
No, we never get to the Italian market ever. It's just the library because that's all we really have time to do. It's I want to see
Yeah.
the Statue of Liberty. I want to see the Liberty Bell, and I want to see where Rocky ran up the stairs. I want to see the Rocky
Oh,
statue as well, which that's a movable feast from from time to time.
yeah. It's been at the foot of the art museum stairs now for a while. I know they had been
Yeah.
outside the Spectrum for many years.
Mm.
Prior to
Oh, the
that.
Spectrum.
Yes,
Remember
yes, the
that.
Spectrum. Indeed, indeed.
So I was asking more about Rocky because we watched Rocky 4 this week in preparation to decide whether
Right.
this was a good film.
Mm,
And I had a quick view of Rocky just as a throwback because when I watched Rocky 4, it really reminded me of how different a film or how much of a departure that film was from the first Rocky. And it's
yeah.
incredible how different they are.
It is I have this whole theory about it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But and one thing you are saying, and I kind of am kicking myself because at the conclusion of Rocky 4, of course, I said to myself, I really need to just watch the original Rocky because that movie is. I mean, I think did it win the Oscar that year? I believe it did.
It was I'm pretty sure it was nominated.
It was at least nominated, and it is a tremendous, tremendous film. And then there's Rocky 4, which we can talk about.
well, that's the thing because when I watch the film, for me, it sits in a bit of a genre. And I'll be honest, when I watch the film, I I judge a film based on did I feel like I wasted my time? Was I looking at my watch? Was I looking at my phone? And I will say this for the film, I even after having seen it, I don't know how many times, I still watched it and was still entertained by it.
I have no objection to that whatsoever. In fact, I've only seen Rocky 4 twice. This was the second time. And I think I told you the last time we met and discussed it. One of the reasons, or maybe it was in another conversation, but I'd rented it once because I'd read about it and it sounded amazing. And so one time at Christmas, when I was with my cousins, and you know who they are, Daniel and
Yeah.
the crew, I don't know. I was struck with a thunderbolt of inspiration, and I was thinking, what would be fun thing for us to sit around and do? And of course, the answer was to rent some cheesy '80s movie and watch it. And I'd heard over and over again about Rocky Four, but I'd never actually seen it. And this is probably about, at this point, maybe 15 years ago already. But I convinced them to get in on it. I rented it, and we all sat around watching it, and it was the best time. It was one of the best times I ever had watching a movie. I mean, it was a lot of fun. Not because we were moved by the experience of Rocky
No.
Four as an emotional and intellectual experience, but rather because it's a lot of fun, and it is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one other secret about myself before I've never seen Rocky 2 or 3. Never.
So you're not. I think you're not missing. So Rocky 2 actually isn't bad, right? You can see that there's a progression from 1 to 2. Rocky, Sylvester Stallone evolves the character, and you can see a definite evolution from 1 to 4 and onward.
Right.
I would just skip 3. 3 for me. I mean, if I were to put them in order, my personal preference, it's 1, then 2, then 4, then Rocky Balboa, then 3, and then there was 1 after 4, but I don't want to acknowledge its existence. It was that bad.
Right. How do you throw Creed into the mix here? Have you seen any of the Creed films?
You know what? I saw it on an airplane. I'm not going to give it any. When I saw it on the airplane, I recall being entertained by it, but again, I don't want to judge it on its merits. On the small screen with the real shitty headphones that they give you. So I don't know where that sits, but
that's how I saw Rocky Balboa, by the way.
On an airplane, which Rocky Balboa for me was, I think it's important to see Rocky 5 at least once to understand why they made Rocky Balboa. That is why they made Rocky Balboa.
I think without having seen Rocky 5, I understand why they made it because I've read about Rocky 5 and I get that it was a total smoking ruin of a disaster.
It was a dumpster fire. It was an absolute dumpster fire.
In part, as I understand it, because Sylvester Stallone insisted on casting his son in the film, and that never ends well. See The Godfather Part 3, for example. Which I've also never seen. There's some movies I will just tell you, and Rocky is one of them. I will never watch Rocky 2, and I will tell you why. Because I know that the entire reason for Rocky 2 to exist is for him to win. Because at the end of Rocky, he doesn't win. But that's the point of the movie. Is that he doesn't have to win. He just has to finish.
So is that because it's too Hollywood?
Yeah,
so it's too obvious for you.
Absolutely. In fact,
but is that not a contradiction though? You watch Rocky 4, you know what's going to happen.
Well, of course, but see, this is why I've never. And actually, by the way, I should amend myself. In fact, I have seen Rocky 3, but I was 6 years old. Somebody made the odd choice to show it at their birthday party in their home theater, which, of course, in 1984, having a home theater was a big screaming deal. So I guess they wanted to show it off to these kiddies. And that's the movie they elected to screen. The only thing I remember from it is that when his trainer, who's played by Burgess Meredith, and his character's name is escaping me at the moment, died.
Mickey.
I went to Mickey. Thank you. I went to 8 billion pieces. I remember his mom had to comfort the hell out of me and probably didn't know what to do with this, weeping child who just couldn't handle that Mickey had died. I've never seen it since. So I don't really count it as having been seen.
I think when you're 6, it's the appropriate time to watch Rocky 3. That is the right time to watch a Rocky 3. Perhaps. When you're 6, 7. But with Rocky 4, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, if we're getting into why would I watch Rocky 4 when I have not seen 2 or 3? And I pointedly have not and will not see Rocky 2. And the answer is because, and this is kind of where, as we talk about Rocky 4, I kind of want to go with it. It's always, ever since I rented it at one time, and then watching it again, it just reconfirmed my thought process that it's so fascinating how the devolution, if I can use that term, of Sylvester Stallone as actor is mirrored entirely by the devolution of the film sequence in like from Rocky to Rocky 4. Rocky 4 on one level, if I'm looking at it as sort of an austere film critic type, is grim self-parody. I mean, it takes a beautiful concept and, basically, throws 80s glitz all over it, including the character himself now living in a, obviously a very wealthy suburb of what's clearly still Philadelphia, or supposed to be anyway.
Mm,
And, and like the idea that he has a robot running around and, all of the mean streets, tough, hard Scrabble thing from Rocky, the first one, is totally gone and replaced by the glitz, the glamour of someone who's now a multimillionaire, which is true, of course, for Sylvester Stallone in his progression, because prior to Rocky, he was a nobody. I've always thought that one of the great things about the original Rocky is he wrote that film
mm,
and insisted. The studios liked it, but of course, when they purchased the script, they wanted to cast. I'm trying to remember what the name of the guy was. It's too bad for him he didn't get it, because now he's a name you're like, who's that? But at the time, this is who they wanted to be in the movie, because for them, they wanted to cast a known actor because they saw a script and they saw a potential hit, and they offered like a certain amount of budget. I think it was $20 million or something like that to make the film with this guy. And Stallone stuck to his gun, said, "Nope, my script, my movie. I'm
mm.
only going to sell it to you if you let me do it." So they gave in, but they cut his budget in half. And I think the look of the film, the feel of the film, all proceeds from he was, in a sense, the actor version of Rocky, a young, struggling actor, probably living in a shitty apartment someplace, in LA, trying to make it, a kid from, whatever background. And so Rocky is very much a metaphor for his own rise in the industry. And that's why finishing it, and whether win or lose isn't the point. Finish the film, finish the
Mm.
bout is so important. And then, of course, it turned into a phenomenon. And as he lost his way, or as Rocky loses, like the films themselves lose their way in the sense of kind of forgetting that roots, so too does he. It's all about the money. It's all about the Benjamins in the end, and the money washing over both.
But is
Of
that
course,
not the correct path, whether you like that or not in the film? I mean, it. I think the robot is a problem. I think we can agree the robot is a problem. And
oh
actually, I found a few fun facts. The robot is actually a thing, not
I was
with
wondering that.
Rocky, and not so
It
the
was a real
robot was
product you
actually
could buy.
I don't think it was a product everybody could buy, but the robot was actually made for children with autism. It wasn't made to fetch Paulie's beer and be his girlfriend, which was
Well,
fucking weird. When I
yeah.
watched it again, so this film for me gets, without giving away my review or my score at the end, I think this film gets 20% better without the robot.
Well, again, it depends on how we're defining better. So I don't want to give away
It's
my
no,
preference either.
it no
my,
no no.
my,
It gets better. There's it's just better without the robot.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Or
But
do you think the robot adds to that level of kitsch that
that
makes it
is
appealing
correct.
to
I
you?
don't think the movie
Okay.
is, I mean, I'm going to have to front load this. I don't think the movie is good in any serious respect. But it is very entertaining. And if you remove the robot, you've removed a decent portion of the laughing, the let's have a laugh entertainment. Because frankly, it's a little slow for the first however long. The robot's always a welcome addition to any scene, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I found it distracting this time around because it was, in my mind, like, I can live with, and I when we talk about what's a good film, I think there's a few different ways to define a good film. And this to me is a masterpiece in the genre it was going for, which is a departure from the first one.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is if I compare, I believe it was Kickboxer with Jean-Claude Van Damme. Now,
Which
Van
I've never
Damme,
seen. Yeah.
in his films, if you ever watch his films, he has always these, similar to Sylvester Stallone, they love. And Rocky 4 was very much into these musical interludes. There was 3 montages in this film
Oh, I
that must
know.
have taken close to 9 to 10 minutes of movie time.
I have
And
something to say about that, but continue.
but with Van Damme, he had a scene where he, I think it's his brother. And apologies to anybody watching this. It's either Kickboxer or Bloodsport. I think it's Kickboxer though, where his buddy or his friend gets the shit kicked out of him and he's paralyzed. And for some reason, the government are telling Van Damme to go home, and he now has to sort of reflect on whether he needs to fight the guy that took out his friend, or whether he should go home. And then there's a musical montage of him walking around Thailand, and in it, he's acting like he's thinking, and you actually hear the music, and it's like you see him going with this like dramatic music in the background. Now, when I watched Sly Stallone do this in his musical montage, it was actually like, in comparison, a masterpiece, because Sly Stallone knows how to act like he's thinking, because he knows that in the editing room, we're going to put together the cuts and the things. So the audience knows I'm thinking. I don't have to act like I'm thinking. But those musical montages, in comparison in the genre, were well done. Now, does that make it a good film? No. But those were well done.
Well, I have a question for you, but before I get there, let me say something about, because you brought up montages. I have to say, from my first viewing of the film, one of the things that I remember being so amusing in it were these montages, because the movie is only like an hour and 29 minutes long. And once you lop off the end credits, and there's not really much of an opening sequence, I remember thinking the first time I saw it, and of course the montages, not only are there three of them, but the one at the beginning and the one after he's leaving his house to go, to the airport to go to Russia, both of them contain significant excised footage from the previous films. Like Rocky, especially the one in the middle, it goes on for several. I think that one's a solid 5-minute montage.
It's a long one.
And it's almost exclusively footage from the previous three films, assembled in what I would say is mostly a nonsensical order. And I mean, it's supposed to be, I guess, telling a story of him thinking back over his relationship with Apollo Creed, and
it means you don't have to watch the other two movies, and that's a terrible marketing decision for the writers.
Right. But and I guess that was maybe what motivated it, was, a review of stuff for those who maybe somehow walked into Rocky IV without having seen 1, 2, or 3. But the bottom line is, I came in to watch this time because I remember thinking it was so funny. I thought, I'm going to use a stopwatch and just see if I were to stop it during all sequences that are actually footage from other films, how much original footage was shot and assembled for this movie. And it turned out not to be as dramatic as I remembered it being. It felt like half the movie was montages and cuts from other films. I think that you wind up getting probably an hour and 20 minutes of original footage, but that's, compared to like a modern film, that is extremely short. There's really only an hour and 20 minutes of stuff they did for this movie. At least, that didn't wind up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, it's very cheaty. It really does water down the film, but at the same time, I don't think the film is the same without the montages. I think
that's a huge cheese factor.
Because I would say, jumping ahead to not that I want to jump too far ahead to this point in the film, I think no matter how good or bad the film is, I always feel like I want to work out after I watch the film. And as cheesy as the workout montages are, they are effective in motivating me. Now, whether that makes it a good montage, I don't know. But I do,
I think the South Park guys had that on the head, right? I'm sure you've seen the Ski Lodge.
I don't know.
Like, oh my goodness, Sean, let's sign off right now and put on the South Park episode.
Which episode was this?
Fun. I think from the 4th season, I want to say. It was an earlier show, and the idea is that Stan and the guys have gone to a ski lodge, and it's patterned after any one of a number of 80s films in the skiing genre, which I'm not sure I knew was a thing, but also any kind of genre.
John Cusack was central to that.
Okay. But any kind of genre where people are learning, like someone like Rocky, like getting trained to box, or the Karate Kid getting trained to do karate, etc. Right? So there's a sequence where, like, the idea of that episode is that Stan and the guys are at this ski lodge, and they keep getting approached by the evil ski kids who are like challenging them, and they're like, "What are you talking about? We don't like, we're not interested. What is this?" But, yeah, so that's kind of funny. But there comes a point where they're like, "All right, I'll see you at the top of the hill on, at Ski Mountain at 3 o'clock on Tuesday,
I
man, or
think I
whatever."
remember
Right?
this now.
Yeah, and then eventually, but Stan's like, "Well, I don't know how to ski. What am I going to do? How am I going to learn to ski by, Tuesday at 3 o'clock?" And then they cut to this song. You need to learn something fast, and right now you need a montage. And then there's like a montage, like a song that's a song about montages. It's a meta montage song.
I know this. I remember this episode now. I have seen this.
I believe they
This,
also reused the song for that movie that they did with the puppets, Team America World Police.
yeah.
I
Yeah, they
believe
did
they
actually.
did.
That's probably where I've heard that because they
Yeah.
were. I forget what it was. They were prepping for the big fight. And this is something. Yeah, I remember this. This is also something Family Guy make fun of as well. Family
Okay.
Guy did a similar thing where they poked fun at montages, 80s montages, but it was more the Revenge of the Nerds music cleanup, and we get a lot of stuff done and turn our dump into an amazing place. And on Family Guy,
Right.
actually they didn't do anything at
Yeah.
the end of the montage.
I think I remember that vaguely. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I want to
Which
jump
that's a
back and ask you a question though, because
hmm,
you had said that you think this is a good movie for what it is trying to be, the
yeah,
genre that it's trying to be, and that it's separate from, say, the original Rocky. So my
yeah.
question for you is to define your terms a little bit. What genre do you think this movie is, and how is it different from what the
Hollywood
original film was going?
80s action shtick.
Okay.
If you compare it to if you look at the 80s and you look at sort of the film, that time I looked in 1985, there was not a lot of good films out there. The best film that I could recognize was Witness with Harrison Ford.
That's a good movie.
Yeah, it was a very good movie. Every other film in that period was really bad. So it wasn't very hard for Rocky to stand out. But if you look at that sort of overly produced action, maybe sport or like similar to what Karate Kid was, that
Sure.
sort of
Sure.
underdog story against all odds. It is a typical Rocky story, but if you compare it to, let's say, anything with Van Damme or Seagal or I'm just trying to think of every action star at the time, and it pulls it off really well. I think the best analogy I can make, it's sort of like if you compare something like the Mission Impossible films with Tom Cruise to that of, let's say, Face Off. They're both shticky Hollywood action films. I would argue actually Mission Impossible is unapologetically good for what it's trying to do. Face Off is unapologetically bad for what it's doing. I compare Rocky in the Rocky 4 film in that way. It's a masterpiece of a bad film.
Okay, and I might even agree with you on that. Like if that's the sort of framework that we're working in, that we're going to acknowledge up front that this is bad. There's really no way to make a good movie with this template. You're only talking about whether it's effective bad or bad. Then I think I can be with you.
It depends on
By
what.
the way, you mentioned the Karate Kid. I just want to make sure you're aware, right? That the guy who directed the Karate Kid directed Rocky.
So I didn't know that actually.
Yes, he
Did not know that.
and Karate Kid. I mean, it's basically the same. It's hitting all the same, notes, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's the same concept, just done for some kids as
Well,
opposed to
Rocky
Rocky.
really was not that Rocky was the template. Rocky was the first, I think, major Hollywood template. I'm sure there's films beforehand that played on that underdog story, to more of a classic effect. Well, Rocky being one. But I think the reason I think we have to question what is a bad film, because the reason I find this to be a masterpiece is it kept my attention for being as bad as it was. And actually, there was points in the film that I got value out of. So I think every red-blooded American, as you're supposed to say, when you hear the announcer yells, "The Russian is cut," I think that 10-second segment, no matter how proud you are or how much of a film buff you are, that's kind of a cool scene.
Interesting.
Would you tell me you did when you watched The Russian is cut, even as somebody who knows it's coming, somebody who is a bit more sophisticated in thought, educated, there's nothing about you that likes that element, even privately, and you won't admit it?
Honestly, it just didn't stand out to me. I was too busy laughing at the politics of
Oh
the film.
no.
I mean, I was laughing. See, that's the difference between Rocky, the original, and Rocky 4. When you actually get
Yeah.
to the fight in Rocky, it's extremely tense. You
Hmm.
know, you feel the tension between himself and Apollo. You feel the anxiety that Rocky's bringing to the fight, and you
Yeah.
feel just as importantly the anxiety that Apollo Creed feels as he starts to realize this wasn't the cakewalk entertainment thing that he thought it was going to be, right? And it's just all very effective because in part it's fresh. I mean, you're saying that this story existed before Rocky. I mean, yes, the idea of the up and comer, but honestly, Sylvester Stallone more or less invented the modern sports film. I mean, you could go from any movie, from you know, uh, whether it's Hoosiers or Rudy or Remember the Titans, et cetera, et cetera. They all owe a debt to Rocky. I mean, he is the one who
But
invented
is
the
it
Hollywood, or Stallone is the one who invented the Hollywood template for this kind of film.
well, I only say that because I've not seen older films like The Contender or Raging Bull. And
Raging
I don't
Bull is
know.
not. Raging
I've
Bull,
not
first
seen
of
it,
all,
so I don't know.
it postdates Rocky for one thing. It's from
Oh,
1980,
does
I
it?
believe. It does.
Oh.
And for another thing, it is very much a character study of a real person, and it's dark and not
I've not
at
seen the
all.
film, so I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. The Contender, I've never seen either, but I kind of get the same impression. No, just the feel good, up and coming. Stallone just about invented that as a template pattern. I mean,
Yeah.
he really did, and his director, John. I looked it up. John Avildsen. He just died in 2017, but he directed The Karate Kid and Rocky, and of course Karate Kid Parts 2 and 3, and Rocky 5. So you have him to blame,
Hmm.
among some other stuff. But um, anyway, Rocky 4. You know, when you get to that fight sequence, it's just laughable. I mean, first of all,
Yeah.
Rocky would not have gone. I mean, Apollo Creed neither. You know, like one of the things about Rocky 4 compared to Rocky is the over, and this is true of all movie sequels as they get more money, more budget, they feel like they
Mm.
have to one up what came before. And so the beating that Rocky takes in round one of Rocky 4, that fight, i- the fight would have been over within 15 seconds if that were a real fight. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no way. You watch the punches that get landed. And I know the concept is that Rocky, that's his whole thing as a fighter. He doesn't have the best reach. He doesn't have the, you know, the hardest punch. He doesn't have this, but what he has is the ability to take a hit. But I mean, we've crossed from, you know, tough but plausible into way implausible by the
Well,
time you
I
hit.
think we have to suspend that by Rocky 3 because the true story, if we're looking for realism, the way Rocky 3 probably would have played out in reality, Adrian finds him hanging from his closet with a note saying he can't take it anymore because of all the knocks to his head from PTSD or whatever it is. That's probably the realistic story. He probably is very brain damaged at this stage.
Yeah.
But it's this film does go a bit over the top. I think the one thing that makes it laughable is they make it a point to say that the Russian it was something like 1,800 pounds per square inch of punching power, and it
Yeah.
was something along the lines of the average heavyweight champion is 900 pounds, and he also murdered Apollo Creed, so therefore they've built this mythological figure into the
Right.
film, which I read actually Sylvester Stallone, when they originally cast Dolph Lundgren, didn't he said, this is from Sylvester Stallone's mouth, didn't like him because he was so, quote, perfect. He was so Adonis like. And that
Hmm.
character was originally meant to be a big, hairy guy, not this like Nordic looking, perfect specimen of a human being. But with that punching power, the fact that Rocky kept coming and kept coming, that was just very Sylvester Stallone. He had a lot of pride in that fight scene. There's other interviews with him where he loved. That's like one of his favorite things he's done is that fight scene against the Russian, whether you like it or not. That's
Well,
just
I
what
mean, it's
he
just
views it as.
I look at it as I'll give you an analogy from perhaps slightly more recent cultural stuff, and that maybe our audience would appreciate. Did you watch Game of Thrones, that show?
Yeah, yeah,
So it's a precious balance in life when you're creating a fight sequence, because obviously the problem that any movie has, or any, and why Game of Thrones worked for as long as it did, as well as it did, is because it upset the normal order of things. If you're doing a movie that's 2 hours and it's a big budget film, and it's supposed to be something that, lots of people buy tickets to go see, people don't like sad endings, right? So you kind of know going in that, like, Spider-Man's not going to have his back broken and be a paraplegic by the end of the film, right? So the problem for the director is, how do I have enough danger that it feels plausible and scary for the audience, like there are real stakes here, even though if you've thought ahead on the film, when the movie is over, Spider-Man wins. It's not like a football game, either one, American or British, right? Where you're the whole tension of the thing is you're rooting for your team and you don't know if they're going to win or not. That's the entire thing that makes it exciting, and that's why
yeah,
gambling in those sports is so awful. Because if you suspect the players are throwing it robs the whole drama from the contest. Movies have this problem where you got to fix that, and so you want to put the hero in enough danger that it seems plausible and tense, and that there's real questions: is the hero going to get out of it? But if you go too far, it stops being tense and it just is silly. And that's what happened to Game of Thrones. Like, if you watch the ending sequence of the Battle of the Bastards from, I think that was season 6, or
yeah,
certainly the White Walkers stuff in the last season,
yeah,
the White Walkers were invincible, and then when you did kill them, they got up and did it again anyway. And
yeah,
so it was like, there's no way, like, this was a massacre, this was a total wipeout victory for the White Walkers. And at a certain point, it's just not, it doesn't, it's not tense anymore. It's just, you're laughing at it. The idea that they're going to beat this is ridiculous. And that's what I saw in Rocky 4, is that they have, in Dolph Lundgren, they've created a character with that actor who's so, with Drago, that is so immensely unbeatable. And then they film it as such. I mean, he's like, really. I mean, with Apollo, I mean, they did the right thing with Apollo Creed. He's killed in the ring, because that's pretty much what
mm,
happened.
yeah,
you know?
yeah, and thus killing probably the best actor in that film.
Yeah, well, there is
So
that.
I view Carl Weathers as I thought it, just to take a bit of a sidebar, because I want to come back. Don't let me
Mm,
forget this, because I want to come back to your point about the invincible enemy piece.
yeah,
But in it, when I watched Carl Weathers in that press conference as Apollo Creed, I thought that
yeah.
was an entertaining interchange, and it reminded me. And I said this on the Bearded Sports channel, of how we don't have somebody that's a Muhammad Ali now, and Carl Weathers played that sort of character, that arrogant but intelligent boxer, very well. I thought,
Oh, he
if
does.
I thought his acting was actually quite good when I think back to that film.
Well, I mean, he's doing largely the same role, and I'm not accusing him of anything, as he was in the first film.
Yeah,
He was great in the first film, and he's continuing.
that's his character.
Uh,
Yeah, of course.
yeah, I mean, yeah, and because I know you want to loop back to the invincibility, I want to loop back and hold on to the notion of the casting of Dolph Lundgren in that role, because I think that's also interesting. But you go first.
So if we go, just jumping back to the whole invincible thing,
Yeah.
I always debate whether I punish a movie for being bad based on the whole slippery slope argument. When you say one thing is bad and then you compare it to something that somebody would say was invariably good. And I think if you look at that Rocky fight, the invincible enemy, if I were
Hmm.
to pose the question, so let me just take a bit of a sidebar. If
Hmm.
I were to pose the question about Lord of the Rings to the majority of the public, whether the third and final installment was a good film, or any of the installments, what do you think the public would say?
Probably good.
So the third film for me was harder to sit through than Rocky 4,
I
because
believe
it
it's too
created,
long, for one thing.
but it's and this is my issue with, let's say, watching the Avengers as a film franchise. I haven't watched it. I've seen bits, or any of the Marvel films. When X-Men first came out, I was a comic book guy. I am, when I was a kid, and I liked it. But with these, Avengers films that are grossing so much money, Lord of the Rings, my problem with them is they are overcoming odds that they've created that are insurmountable with relative ease. And if you look at the third Lord of the Rings film, it was like everybody just showed up at the end. The Eagles started to kick the shit out of the orcs or whatever the hell they were. Where were those Eagles in for the first film? Like, why couldn't we get everyone together earlier? And they overcame these impossible odds with relative ease, and everything was happy. And then it had the happiest ending in the world, and it was just so schlocky. And I just was like, oh, this isn't good. And when I compare that to let's say the last fight scene in Lord of the Rings versus the last fight scene in Rocky, I felt like you could still get some enjoyment, even knowing how sticky it is. I
Right.
felt like there was enjoyment to be had in that at the very least.
I actually completely agree with you. And first of all, I mean, you're singing my song, and that's the problem. Yes, with the Avengers films, with Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings, like the outcome is not in doubt. And so this piling on of odds, like, ooh, instead of having them fight five bad guys, let's have them fight 5 billion bad guys or whatever,
yeah.
right? And you're like, because especially now with digital stuff, I mean, they can digitally create however many villains they want, right?
Their superpowers just get stupid. Like it's
Yeah,
just
everything is dumb.
yeah. Deadpool is
And
the only film that I've watched in the genre that I really enjoyed.
I have not yet seen that, and I really should.
Do yourself a favor. It is phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, so I agree with you, and I think that the real line. See, I don't want to say I didn't get enjoyment out of Rocky Four. I do. I can't sit here and, in intellectual honesty, call it a good movie in the sense you mean, but I can say that it is an entertaining movie, and I think part of the secret to that is that you can get. I'm laughing at the final boxing match in Rocky Four because they've turned Dolph Lundgren into, as you say, a superhuman. But to
Yeah,
the degree that it retains any tension, I think part of it is it's still mano y mano, right? It's one guy versus one guy, and you always feel like, hey, that's the phrase that you have in the lexicon, right? That you have a puncher's chance of something. That
yeah,
even if you've got a good left hook and the right set of circumstances, somebody who's well outmanned could theoretically win a bout because they only have to defeat one person. And then
yeah,
the second thing is, I mentioned this earlier, but it is the saving grace of Rocky for not, and I don't mean this meanly, I think it's judicious. You don't really have that much. The story's getting kind of thin at this point.
yeah,
You've done it a bunch of times. Everyone knows the basic notes you're going to hit, the beats you're going to see. So don't overdo it. It's an hour and it's boom, boom, boom. It's extremely efficient. Efficient.
yeah.
It's an
But I think
hour and
there's a
29 minutes.
there's a catharsis to those kind of films, and I
Yeah.
think that expeditious nature of getting from A to B is what makes it passable as a film that's not very complex
Right.
and not even that well scripted, really.
No, and that's what I mean, in comparing it to, I mean, I actually think that's a perfect, brilliant comparison to something like, I couldn't take any of the Lord of the Rings movies, honestly, but I never even watched the third one because, you know, 3.5 hours. I mean, this is not a. I hate Peter Jackson. It's overbloated, overdone. The musical score. I mean, the musical score is practically a movie by itself. It's interfering and telling you how to feel and think. It interjects itself at every key moment. And then he comes out with the DVD special edition where we tack on an additional 45 minutes worth of footage. I would rather hang
Yeah.
myself than watch those things. So,
But there's times where that is. I think there's a time and a place for that type of thing. I saw a film recently that I knew was going to be what it was, and I
yeah.
really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it, even though there wasn't much craft to it. Have you seen the film The Equalizer?
No, I didn't realize they
Denzel
did a
Washington.
movie of The Equalizer.
Denzel
Oh, I do
Washington,
remember that. I remember that came out. Yeah. Okay.
CIA retired CIA guy working for like Home Depot, and he's retired. And the film pretty much kicks off. He goes to this. He has, I guess, PTSD, and he can't sleep, so he goes to a cafe every night at like 2 a.m. and reads Catcher in the Rye or something, along that line, or Moby Dick it was. And there's a prostitute who comes in every night, and she sort of looks at him as a positive thing, and then she ends up getting the shit kicked out of her, and he de facto comes out of retirement because he's got this sense of justice in him. and
Right.
you know he's going into these situations. It's they script it very well. You know he's going into an impossible situation, and his skill gets him out of that situation. He has him kicking the shit out of these bad people. There's something cathartic about that, and I think there is a time and a place for that type of thing, and that's why I give those films like The Equalizer. If we ever do this, I've sort of spoiled it a little bit. That's a very
I would
obvious
take a look.
film. Yeah, it's an obvious film that I give a lot of credit to because I know what the outcome's going to be, but I enjoy the process of watching it happen.
Well, right, and I want to be careful here because there's nothing wrong really with a formula film. It's just
Yeah.
how is it executed, and that's I think that's again to return to your example because I think it's really on the money. Is for all the praise heaped on Lord of the Rings. Now, admittedly, I have not seen the third one, but I don't need to because I saw the first two and I got a sense of
Mm.
what his sensibilities are. I also
Those were
saw his,
better.
yeah, well, I saw his King Kong, Peter Jackson. And, there's another one, King Kong, the original film, famous, still watched, right? It's 70 minutes long. His version, he somehow turned into 3 hours and 20 minutes because of this overindulged sort of bloated thing. A movie that does a formula that's tried and true, but just executes it perfectly. I mean, honestly, I just rewatched The Karate Kid after watching Rocky 4, and I did that with my son. And I would say of The Karate Kid, there's nothing in The Karate Kid that is gonna, you know, make it into any film school discussions about like, wow, innovative technique or brilliant writing or brilliant. But to me, what that is a by the numbers script that's written extremely tightly and filmed and executed extremely well. So that when you're watching it, it really it just it's like a little clinic in how to make without being it's not artsy, it's not trying to be anything more than it is. A very entertaining, well put together film. And
By the way, have
it,
you ever seen the fan theory about, well, not fan theory, but somebody put together a video about how Daniel Russo is actually the asshole throughout that whole film?
Daniel Russo. Oh, you know what? I have to. I think I have heard of that, but I've never actually
Yeah, where
looked
he rocks up and steals the guy's girlfriend, and then at the dance he actually
into.
sprays water on him, and like
Yeah.
all this shit goes wrong because of Daniel Russo. That's the one negative. We'll have to save that one for our karate. We'll have to do Karate Kid at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, because that's a movie I did not see actually either when I was a kid. For some reason, I just didn't, even though it was very popular. I remember kids in the schoolyard doing the thing,
yeah, yeah.
and for whatever reason, I don't know. I didn't push my parents to see it. Then the moment passed, and I never saw it until like I was 30. And one time I was like, I've never seen this movie. I mean, let me check this out. And I could not have been more pleased. I mean, I felt like it really again,
At Marita.
it has an equal. So I thought it has kind of equal helpings of its 80s cheese all over the place. The idea that there's a random set of, toughs on the beach in California who are all coming from one karate school is like laughable on its face. But on the other hand, yeah, Pat Morita's performance is really, it really is a tour de force, actually. I mean, given,
Yeah, I
the
agree with that.
limitations it was. Yeah, so.
Well,
Um,
it's not. I think not to. We're jumping off of Rocky a bit. I think we
we
need to
are.
save this a bit. But just on that Pat Morita point, I think the way they did that in Karate Kid, there was more to the process in the adapting the wax on wax off. And the last thing we reviewed on this channel before you and I started doing this was the Cobra Kai miniseries that Hugh
Oh,
really
okay.
loved. And Hugh is somebody who's into fighting. He's
Okay.
he's somebody who's trained and he loves MMA. And he doesn't like the whole, like, for him, it's because he's so close to the content. The wax on, wax off is not how you train someone to block a punch. But I said, for somebody who's not the uninitiated, are going to look at that and say, well, that's a plausible way to like teach a young guy to like be patient and learn technique in a very weird way. Now it's very movie shticky, but
Right.
I found it was original for me at that time. It was not something I'd seen to that degree in that type of film.
And taking your lead and not wanting to drift too far off the point, but I will say this: if you were here, I'd say I don't think the point necessarily is that wax on, wax off teaches him the technique. It it gives him enough of the technique that when he learns the proper technique, he has the strength to do the technique, because
He was a
doing all
whiny
that
little shit.
waxing off.
He needed a bit of like taking back a peg anyway, you know.
Well, right, and really, I mean, like the idea of waxing off by hand, putting the wax on, taking the wax off. There's a certain amount of like exertion, and that's the point. When he hits him, it's that he's stronger than he was than when he started. Um, but any event, we should leave that for another day. Back to Rocky Four.
Back to Rocky.
I want to make a point here, because you brought up Dolph Lundgren, and one of the things that makes me laugh as I watched the film, and I kept thinking about as it developed, is that it's interesting that you were saying, I did not read into this or look it up, that Sylvester Stallone was unhappy at first with the casting of Dolph Lundgren. Yeah. Because what occurred to me is, like, this movie is obviously nakedly political in its little political, in its little mission, which is funny in and of itself, because I'm thinking, if you're like Mikhail Gorbachev and someone shows you this movie, and I assure you someone did, because he's represented in the film, so you're going to sit down and take a look at
even the birthmark.
Yeah, this is how Americans think of you. This is what they think of you. This movie is, I guess, trying to create some kind of bridge between the cultures, and suggest a way for the two to somehow, resolve their differences. Is there anything about this film that wouldn't be completely insulting if you were a Soviet? I mean, it is top to down, just right down to the fact that this is bringing up Dolph Lundgren, is that they have cast as a Soviet basically a Nazi. I mean, he's a Nazi. Well, it's not his fault. His name is Dolph.
He's very master race, and that's sort of there is definitely overtones of that. And it's,
which is not the Soviet thing at all, but they've completely cast the Soviet politics as the Nazi politics, which is like, I mean, if I'm like anybody in the Soviet Union, I'm really like, this is how you're paying us. Like, our Soviet Union is not about master race, whether you agree with it or not, and whether it's true in practice or not. The theory is the rise of the working classes and the egalitarian society, as opposed to the, capitalist top-down, permanent underclass of America. That's the way they want to cast it. It is certainly not about, like, finding like the most pure racially Russian person and, building up a Superman out of them, which is the way that this comes across.
Yeah, that was very much the theme. It's a really good point, actually. I didn't even connect that they were, because the Soviet Union was very much, I mean, they're coming off the heels of communism, and there wasn't much of that sort of communism. I think there's a departure in communism from, let's say, the master race and the Third Reich, where there was a lot of, I guess there was a lot more investment in that community than the Communist Party. And I don't know. I think at that point, and if you look at 1980, it was 1985 the film came out. That was only 2 years removed from when I did I don't know how to describe it. When I was in first grade, I remember this. We had to go into the hallway and do a drill. It was like a Cold War drill. It was weird.
Right.
I'll never forget it. It's like one of the few early memories I have, and that's only going to be about a year to 2 years, maybe a year and a half before that film came out. So I'm wondering if Sylvester Stallone, because at the end of this film, the most cringy, awkward speech, trying to act like Rocky making a political statement,
right?
It's probably, between that and the robot, are the two worst parts of the film for me. That political turn.
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by worst. I mean, they're, to me, the highest entertainment value. I mean, to me, it ends on a crescendo. I mean, and the joke, I mean, the reason why I wanted to watch Rocky 4 at all is that I used to follow, who Bill Simmons is? He used to write a column for ESPN.com. And he used to talk about Rocky 4 in terms like this. He used to say that it was, Rocky defeats communism. And that's exactly the way the movie ends, right? Like, as the fight's going on, the Soviet audience suddenly decides it's going to side with Rocky over their own guy, which is itself laughably stupid. And,
if they continued the film 24 hours forward, McDonald's signs its first contract for a McDonald's in the middle of Red Square. There's KFC vendors in the stadium. All of a sudden, it's a big win, a big coup for democracy.
Right, exactly. And it's the idea that the US ideology, and think about who Rocky is supposed to represent. It's the rugged individual. If the Soviet it if if the conception of the Soviet, let me rephrase, if the Soviet conception of the individual, at least as the Americans would describe it, is that the individual is suppressed or unimportant or in some other way minimalized by a system where the state and the collective are the important thing, and that an individual person's will is less important. The whole point of Rocky is that it's the individual will that can overcome all obstacles, including
Yeah.
someone who's a foot taller than him, with a reach, 18 inches wider, and who's like made of solid steel and punches his way through brick walls. This
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
but all it is the individual will. And so it's the notion of the individual, a simple, an individual rugged by himself with his power, overcoming the entire state. I mean, it's like really the ideology of the West writ large overcoming the Soviet ideology in one movie, in one fight. That's what makes it funny, and unintentionally so, but it is.
There's well, I think when you look at the even going into that last scene, going into the training, even leading up for that, you see a lot of these Western influences with Paulie, and their sort of expectations of what society should look like. The landing into this third world uh, country where there's barely any electricity and the roads, everything's covered in snow and there's no it's not even like the same planet they're going to. And it very much is a Westerner's view of what Russia looked like at the time,
Absolutely.
going into this farmhouse to train. And
But
even like
also,
the stadium that they're going to watch the fight in is full of nothing but soldiers. There's no
absolutely.
people there.
Yeah.
There's nothing but soldiers there. This is how Russia rolls. This is the Soviet Union. They don't
Right.
have people that are doing shit. They're all soldiers.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a creation, it's an American view of the Soviet Union that weirdly mixes it with kind of Nazi thing, which is extremely present throughout the film. And keep it, like, I think it's interesting to note, you're right, the idea that they land in the middle of nowhere and the roads are all broken, is sort of like a dig from the American perspective. This is what the Soviet Union's like. They can't keep their stuff together. Like their economic system has failed, so the state is a mess. And yet, having him be in the middle of the nowhere thing helps to push the other ideology of the film, which is again, you notice that Rocky's training sequences are him, Paulie, and his wife using extremely rustic equipment. And it's the idea of just an individual and with what he has around him, he's going to train to fight. Meanwhile, you see Drago's,
High
entourage
tech.
of people,
Yeah.
right? High tech, all that. So the Soviets are both super high tech, trying to defeat us with technology. Us lone individual, rugged Western types who, and I say Western, I'm using that term advisedly because I'm thinking of even like the idea of movie westerns, in the
Yeah.
50s and 40s, which pushed that ideology of the one lone man who's going to go out and tame the West and live a man's life, no law, just what you can force and what you can kill with your own hands and live by the sweat of your brow. You have that whole thing going on. And you have the same critique of, but also their state's junk. You know what I mean? Like, we're way more technological. We have robots. It's a
Not
fun
only
to
that
kind of
though,
juxtaposition.
one element too. The Russians had to cheat because there was a scene with in the training montage where they were injecting what is perceived to be steroid in the Russian
Absolutely. Right.
for so there's even okay, so they have to cheat and Rocky. I mean, it's if you take it in isolation, what they wrote into the story with Rocky training in the farmhouse, I thought was an enjoyable part of the film, if any. You
No,
know,
it is. And again, like, this is the line I'm trying to get. It is enjoyable. It is. I had a grand time watching it.
yeah.
I paid attention. I had fun. But I'm also recognizing that the film is extremely jingoistic. You know, Rocky makes, as you said, this long speech that closes the film, which is laughable precisely because he's lecturing this pretend Soviet audience made up of Soviet soldiers about how, maybe like seeing this, we can somehow find a way to get together. And yet every point of the film is casting the Soviets as these ridiculous bad guys, like
Parody.
cartoonishly Yeah, and Americans is totally good. The Soviets cheat. They have great technology that they, because their fighters can't do it on their own like Rocky. But of course, at the same time, their technology sucks. They're also kind of, crypto Nazis. Yeah, even though that's not really part of their ideology whatsoever. It's certainly part of Hitler's, the race thing, and they don't really get too far into that. But the fact that they have him kill Apollo Creed, you could argue at the front end of that film is about that master race kind of thing, like having this
Yeah.
ridiculous Nordic
Wow.
dude,
Yeah.
and it inverts the first film, which as much as I like the original Rocky, I must admit there is some problem. I think we talked about this if we ever talked about real Rocky. And you could say the same thing about Hoosiers and the same thing about, I feel like there was another example I had where there is this kind of uncomfortable undertone to the film because you're talking about an Italian guy from South Philadelphia in the middle of white flight in the 70s, which were bad times for cities in America where white people are moving out of the city. And here's this like Italian stallion who's going to come across and beat up the big black threat that has moved in on their turf in Philadelphia. There's this really, I think we talked about Death Wish is the same way. There's this very
Yeah.
scary undercurrent. Hoosiers is the same thing. The all-white basketball team that wins the tournament at the end against the all-black basketball team.
Which Hoosiers is a different story. I would say Rocky, it's an inadvertent piece. I don't think there is any unintentional, even I wouldn't even say unintentional. I just think that's the way the story was written. Sly Stallone wanted to be in the film. He wanted to
I
represent a
agree.
cross section
And they
of
wanted a
Philadelphia.
Muhammad Ali type, and you're
Yeah,
not
and
going to do a Muhammad Ali type who's white. That doesn't make any sense.
I think Hoosiers is an interesting. I haven't thought about that, but I think Hoosiers is a little bit different. And I kind of want to watch that film again. I haven't seen that in years.
It's not the central focus of the film, but it's just very noticeable that when they get to the big game at the end, the team they're playing is all black. And of course, otherwise, it's this all little rural white high school somewhere in Indiana. It's all mythic. Um, but anyway, Rocky Four kind of purposely inverts to the degree if someone wanted to argue that Rocky has this sort of uncomfortable racial undercurrent going on, Rocky Four inverts it to further cast the Soviets as, oh, by the way, yeah, they're these crypto Nazis, who are there with their master race guy who's injected full of steroids to defeat the not only American individualism but American pluralism. Just one more notch against them. And yet somehow at the end of this, all of this, Rocky is trying to somehow make an appeal to the Soviet Union. Clearly, I mean, it's almost Sylvester Stallone himself stepping out of
Yeah,
the character for a moment to make a direct appeal to the Soviet Union. Watch my movie and know that you should just be American and we'll be great. It's like, how can you possibly be this tone deaf?
it just reminded me of like almost like drunk courage. It's almost like you're at your company Christmas dinner and you've had too much to drink, and all of a sudden you get the courage to, you know what? I'm going to take on the boss and I'm going to tell him what's wrong with you. That's kind of where it's like you want to fight, and now you're like, you know what? I'm going to get into politics right now, right after the fight. I'm going to speak to the. It's very weird.
You don't think that the cherry on top of the entire Rocky Four pie is when Mikhail Gorbachev stands with the rest of the crowd to applaud Rocky's speech?
It's 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 not, well. It's even that. It's the fact that he was won over and was actually supporting Rocky at the end of the fight, like towards the
Right.
end of the
Yeah.
fight.
And
Everybody
that's
was cheering for Rocky at the end, and I can't think of any situation where if the roles were reversed, the fighter that I was rooting for was starting to get, like it wasn't even like the Russian was getting beaten that badly. It was a fairly 50-50 fight. And they decided, you know what? We came here wanting to see this big Russian smash this little American. I might change my mind on that. I can't
right.
think of any sporting event that I've ever thought, well, I might root for the other guy now.
Yeah, it's funny that you should say that because I will say to the degree that the film works in the way it was intended to work, as opposed to like the self-parody, so bad it's good thing that I've been kind of tracking. It's that there is a certain degree of plausibility in that, despite all of its implausibility, which is that they do a good job of painting the picture. Like the Soviets expect this to be, after what happens to Apollo Creed, they expect this to be just a total annihilation. This is the crowning moment. So it's a little bit like, if you're putting it in modern terms, maybe not this year because of the change, but if you had like the many years of New England Patriots with Tom Brady, or the Lakers with LeBron James, somehow finding themselves in the Super Bowl, the finals against some little team you never heard of. Say the Eagles in 2017 with Nick Foles as
Yeah.
the backup quarterback in there, and you're just expecting a total wipeout. And maybe even Patriots fans could appreciate, like, holy crap, that kid who had no business doing this somehow pulled it off, right? There is, because we are naturally, I think, inclined to take the part of the underdog to some degree. It's hard to deny even Yankees fans have got to admit it's cute when the Red Sox win, right? You know what I mean? Like,
I don't know if any Yankee fan would agree with that, or any
well, you're
Patriots
right.
fan. Tom
Well,
Brady
yeah,
definitely is not a fan of Nick
that
Foles.
was probably a bad example because the Red Sox, of course, are just as bad as the Yankees these days with the money. But like, if the Rays or the Orioles knock off the Yankees, it's hard to get too upset, right? If you're a Yankees fan, because it's like, wow, the little engine they did it. Isn't that cute? You know?
So I think we need to really, as we come up here to the hour mark, we need to
Yeah.
get our first scores on the doors, so to speak.
Okay.
And I'm willing to throw my number out there to start, and I think I'm going to give it some credit for
Okay.
being good for what it was. But at the same time, I also have to measure against the fact that it wasn't a sophisticated film. There was a lot of problems in it for me that I had trouble getting past. Even down to the fact that the fight even happened. This
Right.
if you look in the boxing world, you don't just have some country rock up and say, "We're going to get into boxing. Who's the biggest heavyweight? Let's set up a fight." It doesn't work
Yeah.
that way.
No.
Well, I'll be a bit charitable, and honest. I'm just going to go with a scale of 1 to 10 here. I'm actually going to say a 6.5 out of 10,
A
and I'm
genuine.
I'm going to say
Go ahead.
6.5 because it's what it is, and it's maybe a bit of a nostalgia for me. It was a film that when I was younger motivated me, and got me excited. I'm a bit older now, so I can see it for what it is. But I think as far as being able to make a film with that script and a lot of the acting and just all of the things we've discussed, entertaining. I think that there that's incredible. So I'm going 6.5.
So I will say, as a preface to how I would score, the,
Go
the
with your
trick
heart.
with the trick with any movie like this is trying to discern to what degree the filmmakers themselves were in earnest or sincere, right? Because it would be easy enough to imagine that Sylvester Stallone has navigated the Hollywood uh, structure, or whatever you want to call it, the Hollywood politics and all that, and he's pretty probably sophisticated on one level, and he probably understands what an artsy good film is, and he also understands what a cheap commercial cash grab is, and that this is unabashedly the latter. That he knows he's just going to make a feel good movie that'll turn a quick, he'll make it short. He'll, by keeping the film short, he can make it quickly, so he can, limit. Even though actors who've been in the film now, series for a while, can get paid a lot more than they used to from the first film. At this point, they're also by keeping the film short, you can keep it under budget, all this. So you can basically turn this thing around and make a quick buck. And the way to do that is to have people like it, um, and make it a feel good movie and just basically pander to your audience. And so in other words, all that is to say is if it's a cynical thing with him, if he's like, he never intended it to be taken seriously, there's that. Or is this actually what Sylvester Stallone thinks a good movie looks like? Does he actually stand by it? And I have not really done that much research into that question. But from some things that you've said, and just looking at the film, my own estimation is that indeed Sylvester Stallone believed this to be a good film. And because it is
I
in
would
earnest, I will say on an entertainment value, I could give it a 5 because it is, as you
agree.
say, well executed for what it is.
Yeah.
But I'd have to, a 5 out of 10. That seems to me to be. I can give you 5 points for doing it right.
So then we're sitting then at a 5. Well, so I'm at 6.5 and you're at 5. So we're sitting at a 5.75.
Something like that.
Okay. So 5.75 on Rocky. And I really enjoyed that. We should be, for everybody watching this, I think I found a way to turn this into a podcast finally. So keep yourself glued to the socials and also the channel. I'll make sure that I'm sharing the link. I think on Spotify it'll be available, possibly Apple.
Now, before we sign off, can we talk about how we would score it? Not like sort of the ironic scoring, like because I would watch this movie again in a heartbeat.
This is why I
That's
gave
not
it a
quite.
6.5.
Well,
This
but
is this is what
again, go ahead.
what I was gonna say. This is why I would give it a 6.5, because the quality, the acting isn't brilliant. Although I would say Paulie and Apollo carry the film. And even the trainer for Rocky, he's always been solid, or the
Yeah,
Apollo's
yeah,
trainer.
yeah.
But it is just, a very obvious, cringy at times, shticky film that entertains. And I just find that to be, I'm fascinated that it can do that. And that's why I give it a bit more credit. So for me, I work that into my 1 to 10 scale.
Oh, I see. Because, like, I mean, in my mind, there's the 1 to 10 scale of, okay, if I'm thinking about this, is it a good movie or not? That's a 5. If I'm thinking about this, is this entertaining because, I'm laughing and having a good time? It's a comedy. Didn't mean to be a comedy, but it's comedy. Oh, I get like a 7 or an 8
Yeah.
on that
But
scale.
this is why I think this is a film that's a 3. And if you look at the body of work, it's probably a 3 or a 4.
Okay.
But it pulls off. How can I describe it? It's almost like a real manufactured pop song that's gotten really popular. That for all intents and purposes is very well executed, even though it's got 3 chords. The film has perfected the genre of what it was trying to pull off. Now that genre doesn't offer much content or much complexity.
Yeah.
And for me, that's where, because if you compare it to, let's say, a film that we would agree, and we'll save this in case we review it, but let's say you and I take a film that we're pushing 9 or 10, it's comparably not as good as that film. So on that scale, it can't be a 9 or a 10. So Rocky 6.5, and I might even be being a bit generous with that 6.5, but
Well, I
I'll
thought
stick to it.
we might be. I thought maybe we would be doing separate tracks, but if we're going to do the same track, I'm going to bump my score up then because on a rewatchability scale, I would recommend this film to anyone listening to us, especially if you can get like a nice 12-pack of beer and a few guys together. It's a riot.
Yeah.
So I would have to say on that, if that's where we're going, I would even go so far as to give it a 7, with the understanding that that's not a 7 out of 10 on quality as such, but on the overall experience of watching Rocky 4.
See, I thought about. I know exactly what you were thinking. You're thinking there's some films that are amazingly trashy, like in a good, like I really get value out of this film. It's so bad, it's unintentionally bad, and that's there's something fascinating about watching these car crashes.
Absolutely. And I
And I
would
struggle.
add just right there, continue in a second, but part of what makes an entertainingly bad movie is that it can't be a total disaster. Because if it's a total disaster, it has to be well made on some level. It has to be paced well or acted well, or something has to work to hold your interest. I used to watch a lot of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and if you watch that, like to me, the movies that were truly just abjectly awful on that always kind of died when you would watch that show because the movie was just there's nothing to work with. It's just bad. The movie has to have you doing at least a few things right to hit that sweet spot. And Rocky 4 does some things right. So anyway, continue. Sorry.
But we'll have to think about that, because I've been thinking about the same thing on having sort of that. We've talked about having that Seagal scoring scale uh, of uh, of terribleness. Maybe we do have it. So I still wouldn't, if we did have a separate scoring scale, I would still give Rocky a 6.5 because of what it's able to pull off. Just if I want to make it comparable to every film, I don't think it's worth a 3 or 4, even though. So I still would give it the 6.5. I would stay on our shtick scale. I mean, I would give it a. I mean, it's a tricky one, because I almost say if I put it on that scale, if I were to compare it to, like, I'm trying to think of a good comparison. If I were to compare it to any like Steven Seagal film, which we'll have to review a Steven Seagal film. It's not even in the same ballpark still. Like Steven Seagal films are so abjectly bad and enjoyable. Like the bad enjoyability of Rocky versus the bad enjoyability of a Steven Seagal film. I don't find them on the same plane.
I haven't seen enough Steven Seagal, so right, we'll have to do one.
Well, let's put a pin in this conversation and think about how we want to move forward. I would definitely have the 1 to 10. So I think shall we amend our score then to a 6.75 for Rocky?
I agree.
Okay, so Rocky's a 6.75. I will make a list of what we're scoring so we can see how, because I do want to compare all of these films.
I think that's a good idea.
So Rocky is a 6.75. Next week, we're going to do something I think a bit different. We talked about this, and I don't know what you think about this. Watching, let's say, a couple episodes of The Dukes of Hazzard, and we talk about this TV show. I don't know if it's something you have access to.
Well, I'm sure I'll figure it out. I'm in like Flint.
Well, you can rent them, I think, on Prime. You might be able to get them free.
If I have to rent, they're like $2 an episode, that'll be fine.
Something like that. So I would recommend watching 3 or 4 of them if you can, because one isn't going to do it. You really want to get a feel for it. Maybe one of each season.
Sure.
It's on TV here, and I've been watching it.
I think every kid who grew up during a certain period had the car in your car collection, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I certainly did.
I watched it as an adult. We reviewed one of the shows on this channel, but we only reviewed a show, and we introduced it to Hugh. I want to have a knockdown, drag out conversation on whether it's good. So next week, The Dukes of Hazzard, is it good? So Andrew, thank you very much this week. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Yes, always.
We'll definitely get this up, and I'll let everyone know where it's going to be brought. As you can tell, we're going to be a bit more casual. It's going to be more of a podcast style delivery. And each week, what I'll try to do is make sure that we're advertising what show we're doing so you can watch a show or film. I think we may alternate show, film, but we'll keep it fluid and go from there. But until next week, Andrew, thank you so much.
Can I say one last thing, ironically, which is that I hope, I know I was quite talkative today because I've had many thoughts for many years about Rocky IV. And
I love
this was my opportunity to get them out. So I hope I didn't dominate the conversation too much. It's ironic that I say this, I grab extra time to say that, but I apologize if I did.
If you weren't saying too much, that would be a problem. That would be a problem because this helps out. So I would argue that we were probably 50-50, but I would say keep doing what you're doing, friend.
All right. Well, then we'll see you next week, and thanks so much.
I am going to sign off and take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.